5 years after the unprecedented change that took place in Iraq, the liberation from a dictatorship and one-party state, Iraqi Kurdistan still has enormous gratitude for the American, British, and other coalition forces that overthrew the regime of Saddam Hussein. A number of mistakes in the planning and prosecution of the war, particularly so in the early stages of nation building, do not outweigh the true justice of the matter for a country that suffered more than 3 decades of totalitarian and genocidal rule. In Iraq, the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime and the creation of a federal democracy, although it still remains a list of unaccomplished goals, has shifted the situation for the better, especially so in the long term. No longer do Kurds have to guess when the next attack by Saddam Hussein will come, as it did 20 years ago in the form of chemical weapons and massive executions. The Kurdistan Regional Government, KRG, has made many significant advances in these recent years of freedom, being the most secure and successful region of Iraq. Not one American soldier has been killed in the Kurdistan region, according to my information. Foreign investors are welcome with open arms, and Kurds generally view the coalition presence in Iraq as an ally and a stabilizing influence. Kurds are a nation with a distinct language and culture, pushed under the dominion of Iraq in 1921 by a British mandate, and then abandoned to its tyrannical rule. Yet, Iraqi Kurdistan has participated to the utmost degree in rebuilding New Iraq. The KRG has gone to great lengths to work in cooperation with the federal government in Baghdad. However, a number of issues remain unresolved between the KRG and Baghdad. And this mainly concerns the Iraq Constitution. This document, in my view, remains the only practical plan to resolve these differences. Federalism is the main binding principle of the Iraq Constitution, but it has yet to have real meaning in Iraq or practical implementation. There's been, as the Colonel described, there's been some development, but on the whole, it hasn't been implemented. Iraq was ruthlessly centralized under Saddam Hussein. Iraq's future needs to be federal and decentralized. Federalism is the only realistic political solution for Iraq. This was recognized by a U.S. Senate resolution last year, sponsored by Senator Joseph Biden, that passed with a 75-23 vote, and that's a number which demonstrates a rare bipartisan agreement over Iraq in U.S. Congress. Federalism is the only sensible way of reversing the trend of waste and malfeasance in Iraq. Without hesitation, I can say that American efforts to rehabilitate Iraq would have proceeded much faster and been more productive if regional governments had received more emphasis from the beginning. If Iraq's neighbors do not support the aim of Iraqi federal democracy, then at the very least, they must not interfere. Iraq's authoritarian neighbors, and many of their media is government-controlled, resent the concept of federalism and demonize the principle at every occasion. The hysterical response to the U.S. Senate resolution concerning federalism in Iraq is a clear example of their resentment for a basic principle of democracy, and that's devolution of power. They also intentionally ignore the fact that the only successful and sustainable example of a state in the Islamic Middle East is that of a federal state, and that's United Arab Emirates. Kurdistan envisions its federal status in Iraq as a nation within an open federation, with the ideal models of Canada, Switzerland, Belgium, and other federations being used as examples. And according to my information, there are 27 federal countries in the world officially. While these models provide political vision, the framework of the Kurdistan region within Iraq will be established according to its own particular history and context. Kurdistan endured decades of political domination and military aggression from Baghdad. From the Kurdish point of view, many of the outstanding issues are a matter of recognizing the dark periods of Kurdish history and preventing their reoccurrence in the future. The failure to carry out the normalization of Kirkuk and the referendum described in Article 140 is one major example. If the Constitution continues to be a document without meaning, it will be impossible for Iraq to succeed, just as it would for any constitutional democracy. Kirkuk is principally an issue of repairing the crimes of the past and reconciliation for the future through the political will of a local vote on its unification with the KRG. Both Kirkuk government and Kirkuk city were the scene of a long Ba'athist campaign of expulsion and ethnic cleansing for control of its resources. Secondly, Kirkuk is a test of strength for the Iraq Constitution. Those who perpetually argue for consensus in Iraq as a solution must understand that backroom deals are no substitute for constitutional agreement. Also, it's a test for federal politics in Iraq because either way, it will have a local government that represents its multi-ethnic nature, even if it's within the Kurdistan region. Baghdad has yet to show that it's serious about addressing the issue. Third, it's an issue of security, and I mean, if it is ratified through a referendum, KRG has the best record so far in Iraq of security and also of protection of minority rights. So in that regard, it would also be a positive development. Another point of contention between Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan region, and Baghdad is the issue of oil contracts. The KRG has signed contracts with foreign oil companies for exploration and development of Kurdistan's oil resources. The oil minister in Baghdad has made direct threats to these companies for signing contracts through the KRG. The right of management and development with foreign companies will continue to be protected by the KRG, and the reason for this is that it ensures the past record of using the oil bureaucracy to undermine Iraqi Kurdistan. It ensures it will not be repeated. That's why they protect it so closely. Every cent earned from the existing oil fields and the newly developed fields in the Kurdistan region will be directed to Baghdad, and from the oil ministry it will be distributed throughout all of Iraq. So every cent, it will go into Baghdad. In addition, the KRG has done a far better job of encouraging foreign investment in Iraq. Iraq must undergo change toward a liberal economy if it is to liberalize on the whole. And all these outstanding issues must be confronted if Iraq is to move forward. To step back, in conclusion, Iraq has had many setbacks since March 2003, but we must not forget the longer history before this intervention, such as the massive bloodshed that followed the Gulf War, the intervention in 1991. Patience should be afforded to Iraq in the wake of living under a policy of divide and rule for so many years. In the old Iraq, there was no political disagreement, since this alone received the penalty of death. Every decision came from the whims of one man and his circle. While many still decry the Iraq War as destabilizing, we must compare the present with the unpredictable nature of dictatorship. The list of Iran-Iraq War, the destruction of that, invasion of Kuwait, the draining of the marshes and the habitat of the marsh Arabs, the genocidal campaign against the Kurds, titled the Anfal campaign, and the reprisal after the Gulf War on Shias and Kurds in northern and southern Iraq that resulted in mass graves. And these are just the most obvious examples of interior and external destruction by the regime. For Iraq, and especially the Kurds, there was nothing stable about living under the Ba'athist regime. Abandoning the effort to democratize Iraq, now or in the near future, would be a catastrophe in every sense for the country. The most destructive elements of Iraq would be unleashed. The bloodshed that Iraq had already witnessed since 2003, in the form of terrorism and civil war, would far exceed the scale thus far. Every advocate of withdrawal must also include their plan for how to proceed in this scenario of political and social disintegration. While Iraq's political future is uncertain, there is little doubt of the horror that would follow if the American presence suddenly was taken out of the equation. 5 years is still a very young age for democracy, and the goal of a self-sufficient Iraq is going to take a while, and it's going to be fraught with periods of discouraging news as well as promising. I hope, however, that that the daily shifts of progress and regress do not distract the worthwhile effort for an Iraqi democracy that thrives in the long run. Thank you very much.
I see a couple of my students in the audience, former students in the audience, and as they will tell you, Ambassador Haynes is a guy who has an opinion on everything. And as my children will tell you, his strongest opinions are about the subjects he knows the least about. Now, that is not the case today. Let me just say that as I sat on a plane coming back from New York yesterday, reading the newspaper, I was taken aback to see that once again, President Bush was characterizing our invasion of Iraq as something that had made the world better and the United States safer. Turning to the subject of Iran, again yesterday, General Petraeus said, Iran continues to support insurgents in Iraq. And then I see, opening my paper this morning, that Vice President Cheney, who is currently traveling in the Middle East, portrays Iran as a threat to the region and to U.S. national interests. I urge you, in the context of understanding what's going on in the world today, to take a look at history, because no international crisis arises out of context, without some precedent. And if you look at history, you have to ask yourself, how could we ignore the lessons of recent wars in Vietnam and in Algeria, where I spent 4 years? And in that connection, semantic considerations have real consequences. To call what's happening in Iraq and in Iran a war is to equate it with World War I, World War II, and they are not at all similar, or even the Korean War. In those wars, conventional wars I would call them, the enemy was easily identifiable. They wore uniforms. They lined up on a battlefield. Strategies were easily worked out to combat that kind of enemy. That is not the case today with the war in Iraq. I wish we could develop another word for it, because we need a word that will help us keep in mind that this is a new kind of international conflict, and it requires new kinds of solutions. We cannot win this kind of war where the majority of the population sees our army as invaders and occupiers rather than liberators, where a majority of the people want us out. We cannot win a war where you announce to the world that you wish to impose freedom and democracy on a people who have no experience and no historical tradition with freedom and democracy. And it's dangerous for us to naively think that we can remake the world, and much less Iraq, in the American image. It just isn't going to happen. The other thing is the democratic process, if it is used as intended, can produce results that sometimes we don't like. We cannot win a war where a frequently stated objective is to, and I quote something that's often said, protect American national interests. The rest of the world sees any resort to the protection of stated protection of American national interests, at best, and in the context of Iraq, as guaranteeing self-interest, and in that case, U.S. access to Iraqi oil, and at worst, protection of U.S. national interests is viewed as an American attempt to dominate a country or a region. And one of the reasons why this is especially true in Iraq has to do with something that has become symbolic, and that is the construction of the world's largest embassy, of any country, largest embassy in the world, supposed to have cost about $700 million, now running close to $1 billion and not yet complete. It doesn't look like an embassy. It looks like the headquarters of a permanent army of occupation. But perhaps the biggest weakness in U.S. Middle Eastern policy is a tendency to treat Iran, first of all, as part of the Middle East, and secondly, to treat all of the people of the Middle East as if they were the same culturally, historically, and even religiously. Iranians are not Arabs. They are Persians, and they are the first to tell you so. They do not speak Arabic. They speak Farsi, as do the people of Afghanistan. Iranians have a history of nationhood that goes back as far as the time of the Greek and Roman civilizations, when Iran was known as Persia. All Iranians are aware, and we must not forget this, that the U.S. government imposed upon the people of Iran a totalitarian dictatorship in the form of the late Shah when we engineered the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran headed up by Prime Minister Mossadegh back in the late 1950s. We may have forgotten this. No Iranian has forgotten it. The government of Iran is more visibly popular with the U.S. established government of Iraq than is the United States. And we saw that, was it last week when Ahmadinejad visited Baghdad, state visit to Baghdad. He arrived at the airport, took that extraordinarily dangerous highway in a motorcade into the city of Baghdad, and was received with a red carpet, something that President Bush has not yet achieved. He comes in a helicopter unannounced, and he does not leave the premises, and he certainly doesn't have an honor guard waiting for him. Now, what are Iran's objectives? One, Iran wants to keep the United States out of the region. Two, Iran wants to become a leading player in the politics of the region. And when I refer to the region, I'm referring to a region that is larger than just the Middle East. It encompasses Iran, Afghanistan, and to a certain extent, Pakistan. Of course, being an oil-producing nation, Iran has a policy of preserving as long as possible its depleting oil resources. Hence, I am convinced that it is one of the reasons why Iran is pushing the development of nuclear power. And finally, and I'm sure there are other reasons too, Iran wants to force the United States government to continue a policy in the Middle East that is certain to fail. In that sense, Iran, as is the case with many nations weaker than the United States around the world, knows us better than we know them, and as a result, can manipulate us without our even knowing that we're being manipulated. And by keeping the nuclear pot boiling, Iran is clearly manipulating the United States. Finally, let me recognize the basic weakness of U.S. threats of military action against Iran. It is very important to recognize that such threats do not instill fear in the Iranian government or the Iranian people. Why? They are not like us of the Judeo-Christian tradition. They come from a Shiite Muslim tradition where to die for a just cause guarantees an individual's entrance to heaven and the ultimate paradise. They do not fear death the way we do when we are threatened. What's the solution? As we did in the Iran hostage crisis with which I was involved, we have to recognize the cultural importance that the process of negotiation has to Iranians. It is built into their culture, into their, if I may coin a phrase, their national psyche. It is part of what is referred to by those who live in Iran as the Bazari mentality. It's the traditional Iranian resort to and love of the process of negotiation when you go to the market. If you're going to the market to buy a Persian carpet, the seller will typically have you sit down, have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and that when you finally get around to talking about price, he will quote a price that is outrageous, absolutely beyond the question. Typically, we Americans in situations like that assume that this is the selling price and we pay it. Such is the case with politics. When the Iranians adopt a position that seems extreme to us, don't for 1 minute believe that that's the position that they intend to take. That's their beginning negotiating position. And when we were negotiating for the release of the American hostages in Iran, recognized this. We recognized two things. One, that Iran was at war with Iraq at that time, and that Iran was feeling the discomfort of possible isolation from the world community of nations. They wanted that monkey off their back as much as we wanted our hostages home. And we got them home, and we didn't pay any ransom. The one thing that I criticize my government for, and I did that as a diplomat through something called the Dissent Channel. Do you remember that channel? Fortunately, I was a political appointee, and I wasn't concerned about my next appointment. Furthermore, Reagan had won the election. And because if you use the dissent channel, you can really, if you don't agree with American policy, ruin your career in the Foreign Service. But again and again, I kept saying to my government that the breaking of diplomatic relations is meaningless these days. It may have meant something back in the 18th century, but it doesn't mean anything today. And proof of the pudding is, look how long we have had broken diplomatic relations with Cuba, and Castro is going to die in his bed 40 years later. Look at how long we've had broken diplomatic relations with North Korea, and how difficult that break in relations has made our getting together to even talk to them about their development of nuclear weaponry. And it is extremely important to recognize that breaking diplomatic relations is meaningless when the rest of the world isn't following suit. Cuba, again, is an example, but so is Iraq. And certainly so is Iran. I'm sorry, not Iraq. So is Iran, where we have Russia, China, the European Union, India, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, and so many others maintaining diplomatic relations with Iran. I mean, what influence does our breaking of diplomatic relations have? Okay, I've been very critical. Let me conclude with some solutions. It is very, very important that whoever succeeds this administration gathers the experts together, and they are many, and they are not solely our own homegrown experts. They are experts in world affairs, to figure out how we can reach an accommodation in Iraq and in Afghanistan that would not just guarantee American national interests, that would do what the United Nations Charter chastised us to do, and that is to preserve international peace and security. Until that happens, I am one of those who is a pessimist. But meanwhile, I hope and pray that the successors to George Bush develop a plan for victory where the elements of what victory is are very clearly defined and very widely accepted. Thank you.